The danger is great, but our message today is not one of hopelessness. While there is still time to act and real steps that can be taken, they will have to come soon, very soon, in order to avert catastrophe. Based on their observations, the members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board find conditions in the world to be so threatening that they are moving the hands of the doomsday clock 2 minutes closer to midnight. It is now 3 minutes to midnight. The other test of leadership that we're failing is the effort to reduce world nuclear arsenals. The arms reduction process has ground to a halt, with the United States and Russia embarking on massive programs to modernize their nuclear forces, thereby undermining existing nuclear weapons treaties. At the same time, other nuclear weapons states are joining this expensive and extremely dangerous modernization craze.
There is chaos in the Middle East, two major stories with potentially massive implications for the United States and our foreign policy. First, in Yemen, Shiite rebels tossing the American-backed president out of power, and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, a longtime U.S. ally, is dead at the age of 90. Good morning, everybody. Busy morning here, and I'm Bill Hemmer. Welcome to America's Newsroom as we explore both of these stories. Good morning,
everybody. I'm Martha McCallum. So you have two Middle East leaders and big supporters on the war on terror now gone from the scene. Iranian-supported Shiite rebels stormed the palace of the Yemeni president, who we have backed. That is a big deal, considering our efforts to stamp out al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen, known as ACAP. And then you have the death of Saudi Arabia's king. And that being celebrated now by Islamic militants who called him a tyrant.
Former UN Ambassador John Bolton was speaking last night with Megyn. He says our U.S. foreign policy is to blame for a lot of this. Watch.
This is the consequence of years of neglect and the withdrawal of American influence. We're not entirely capable of changing everything, but one thing is clear. When the United States walks away from the Middle East, it's a further invitation to chaos, and that's exactly what we're getting.
So now what? John Huddy live at our Middle East newsroom. And John, what does King Abdullah's death mean for the United States?
Well, I think Ambassador Bolton touched on it, chaos, number one, but also a transition of power that comes at a time when U.S.-led coalition forces, including Saudi Arabia, continue the battle against ISIS and, of course, the worsening situation that's going on in Yemen. You know, King Abdullah has been, as we know, a key ally of the United States, helping with the war on terror. The hope is that Crown Prince Salman, who's taking over, will continue to have a good relationship with the United States and the fight against terror groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. But there's also concern, Bill and Martha, that these type of terror organizations and groups will try to exploit the transition of power by creating chaos and havoc within Saudi Arabia. Bill?
So who is in charge when it comes to Yemen? Who is running that country, John?
Well, Bill, simply put, no one. No one's in charge. The country's been split up into various rival political factions at this point. Under Yemeni law, though, the parliament speaker would assume the presidency. His name is Yahya al-Rai and is said to be aligned with the Houthis, of course, the anti-American Shiite rebels. Yemeni President Abed Mansour Hadi at least had a good relationship with the U.S. in the fight against terror groups like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as mentioned, which operates out of Yemen and took responsibility for the attacks in Paris. The Houthis are opposed to al-Qaeda, have actually been fighting them in Yemen, but they're also said to be backed by Iran. So Iran could try to exploit this situation that's going on in Yemen and possibly in Saudi Arabia as well.
Yeah,
Bill?
More on that in a moment when we go to the map. Thanks, John Huddy in Jerusalem, leading our coverage from there. Martha.
Lots to keep straight here. So to add to this chaos today, listen to this. Israeli satellites have captured an image that apparently shows an Iranian intercontinental ballistic missile with a range that is far greater than anything Tehran has had up to this point. Charles Krauthammer says that it is Tehran who is the big winner in this chaos from Yemen to Iran and beyond. Listen.
The Saudis are looking at the Iranians in the north, the Iranian allies, which is essentially Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon on one side, and Yemen now to the south and west under Iranian dominance, and they are scared to death. That's why this is a double attack on us. It's a loss of an ally against al-Qaeda, and it's a huge geopolitical gain for Iran, extending its influence over Arab states.
So as Charles is describing there, the situation a big win for Iran, and here is why. The events over the past several years have led us to the following point. Iran here in the east. You know about its influence here in Baghdad. We followed that for years. You know about its influence in Syria, backing Assad, the leader there, and you know its support for Hezbollah in the country of Lebanon. And now in the past week alone, you have Shiite-backed leaders here in Yemen throwing the country, or the government rather, out of power. And the sphere of influence here around this entire area, with Saudi Arabia now right here in the middle in the death of its king last night, or overnight I should say, and just tucked away here in the left-hand corner is the country of Israel. Now remember, Iran is Shia. Al-Qaeda is Sunni. But you have Al-Qaeda now here in Yemen. You've got it in Iraq. You also have it in Syria. It is a mixed and wicked brew in this part of the world, and a power struggle now that we have watched for some time that took some very strange twists and turns, unexpectedly, you could say, just over the past 5 days, and again overnight. So how does everybody react? We're waiting on that.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to come on this, and the president's reaction as well. And how about this? As recently as last September, President Obama was touting Yemen as a success story in the war on terror.
This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years.
Well, that may have been the case, but given the situation now, can the president still tout Yemen as a success? We're going to debate this with our panel coming up.
Just to put a fine point on it, the former government in Yemen was a supporter and allowed us to go after a lot of these terrorist groups operating there in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia, for its part, went after terrorist groups in Syria. And they fought on our behalf as well. So stay tuned. More to come on this and more analysis as well.
Just to add one thought to that, you look at that map that you just showed us, and you think about the fact that the president is not going to sit down with Benjamin Netanyahu
in March,
in the middle of all this, and it's a bit of a head scratcher. We're going to talk about that coming up as well. So all those developments raising a lot of concerns about Iran's growing influence in the Middle East. Last night I spoke with Liz Cheney when I was filling in for Greta on the record, and here's what Liz Cheney had to say. Listen to this.
You know, this has been a very bad day for America and her allies. You've now essentially, with the collapse of the government in Yemen, got Iran basically in control of at least 4 capitals in the Middle East, of Sana'a, of Baghdad, of Damascus, and potentially Beirut.
That is a stunning statement. I'm joined now by Jillian Turner, a former White House National Security Council staffer under Presidents George W. Bush and also President Barack Obama. She is also a Fox News contributor. Jillian, great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
In terms of what Liz Cheney had to say, I mean, that's a pretty stunning statement when you go from Yemen to Syria to Iraq and Beirut as well, as places that she sees Iran, as a result of policies and change, basically having a really big say in all those places.
I think she's absolutely right. It's not an overstatement. And, you know, what happened in Yemen happened very quickly. Just Wednesday, there were reports that the president was going to strike an agreement with the Houthi rebels, and now practically the entire top tier of his government has collapsed. So I think the biggest tragedy here is really that the sectarian strife has once again ruled the day, and that's effectively a worst case scenario for the United States, for our allies in the Middle East, and for this entire anti-terror coalition.
So we went, you know, it feels like overnight. Of course, it wasn't quite overnight, but from having this good relationship with the president who had been, you know, put into office in Yemen, and having their agreement when we did these drone strikes and cooperation in trying to put a lid on ACAP, which is arguably the most dangerous branch of al-Qaeda, to having none of those things. So then when you look at Saudi Arabia and the loss of Abdullah late yesterday, you worked under 2 different presidents, Bush and Obama, and saw how they each interacted with Saudi Arabia. what was the difference?
Well, so since 9/11, Saudi has been, without a doubt, our closest and probably most strategically important Arab ally in the Middle East. But in recent years, there's been this noticeable rift, mostly over Iran policy and Syria policy. As you mentioned, the Obama-Abdullah relationship is really not the same as the Bush-Abdullah relationship was. In 2008, when the president traveled to Saudi, I was part of the traveling staff, and we were all struck by the shared closeness and friendship between President Bush and King Abdullah. But the Saudi regime has really strained that relationship in recent years. Part of the problem is that they're very angry at President Obama for engaging in nuclear negotiations with their arch nemesis, Iran. The other part is that they want us to really step up and take a hardline approach with Assad in Syria.
Yeah, that's a big point. I mean, when you look at the red line moment, clearly they felt that that red line had been breached, and they wanted President Obama to take much more active action in Syria and supporting these rebels, which the president said we're doing the other night in the State of the Union. But from everything that I can see, it doesn't look like we really are.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like inside the administration, people are saying we've broken some of ISIS's momentum, and we're making progress, particularly in Syria. As we know, much of the territory that ISIS captured in Iraq over the last year has held. But the picture painted from outside the administration is a very different one.
So when you look at this whole map that we're talking about right now, and you see the chaos in Yemen, a changeover of power in Saudi Arabia, so difficult relationships there, and obviously what's going on in Syria, and you ask yourself, so Benjamin Netanyahu, our strongest ally in the area, is coming to the United States, and the president is not going to meet with him. I mean, you would think now more than ever they would have to talk.
Yeah, it's a very strange occurrence that, I mean, we hear that he's coming to address a joint session of Congress, which is great, but the fact that a bilateral meeting is not following on the heels of that or coming before it is curious to a lot of us sort of foreign policy observers.
All right, Jillian, thanks. Great to have you in New York.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here.